Men's Right Movements by Christopher Dobrogowski.
I think as a men's rights activist, you are constantly being silenced.
Our boys are flaming out
feminist
academically,
principles
toxic
and
masculinity.
messages.
Society as a whole has an issue listening to men's issues because it makes us feel uncomfortable. We don't really like to hear about men being vulnerable.
There's always a chance for an echo chamber.
Remain on the ones under attack.
Now, what is the Men's Right Movement? Originally started in 1971, the first men's rights organization was originally created to challenge the unfair divorce laws that continue to harm men to this day. The organization was known as the Coalition of American Divorce Reform Elements, and it was started by a man named Richard Doyle. It wasn't until 1973 that the group partially spun off and formed what's now known as the Men's Rights Association. Since then, the Men's Right Movement has been fighting against the oppression of men and for their equal rights and for justice. However, the group has faced huge amounts of criticism and objection for their controversial opinions. As well, the organization has not gone without its fair share of hatred and victimization. This leads into the question I would like to discuss today. How can men safely stand up for themselves as an organization without having to fear being called an associate of a hate group or a misogynist? So commonly ignored in our world today are the issues faced by men. So why is it that when we as a collective stand up and voice our opinions, we're torn down, we're scrutinized, called misogynist, called evil, and called hateful, when all we truly want is equality? The misconception that all men's rights activists are anti-feminist have portrayed men across the world as vile and despicable people, when all we really want is to be treated fairly. While there's no denying the fact that women still face more oppression than men do, men still get discriminated against nonetheless. Living in a world that so historically has been run by men, we're finally shifting towards a planet that is more inclusive, pro-feminist, and full of equality. Through the process, however, with feminism on the rise, many people seem to have forgotten that men still have issues too, and we can't always ignore them. So often do we as a gender get shut out, told we already have all the rights. For too long, stereotypes surrounding men and boys have blindsided the world to issues we face each and every single day. What issues do men face? Divorce laws. In a study conducted by Thomas Leopold for the U.S. National Library of Medicine and the National Center for Biotechnology Information, it was found that on average, divorce is dramatically more detrimental to men, but yet the laws are still biased against them. Abuse. There are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters for women in the United States of America, but there's only one for men. Why is this the case when, according to Statistics Canada, over the age of 15, though 39% of women are abused, still 35% of men are abused as well? Looking at the virtually non-existent shelters against abuse for men in America, it leaves nowhere for our gender to turn to. Boys without father crisis. 1 in 4 families in America are absent of a father. Without male guidance, boys grow up often feeling lost and alone without purpose. Growing up without a father increases a boy's likelihood of suicide by 5 times, their likelihood of homelessness or to run away by 32 times, the likelihood to demonstrate behavioral disorders by 20 times, the likelihood of becoming a rapist with anger issues increases by 14 times, and the likelihood to drop out increases by 9 times. As the rate of divorce spikes, so do the numbers of homes without dads. Because of a lack of a father, a boy is immediately 70% more likely to end up in prison. Since 1972, the California prison populations have spiked 700%, with 93% of all inmates being male. This is in direct correlation to the frequency of divorce leading to the absence of a father. Suicide.
My perspective is I see suicide as a reflection in boys of our inability to help track boys in a constructive way toward manhood. And we see that in the data also. So, for example, before age 9, girls and boys committed suicide equally. Age 10 to 14, twice the amount for boys. 15 to 19, 4 times the amount. Age 20 to 24, 6 times the amount for boys.
These are only a few of the many issues that men continue to face. So knowing all this, why are men still ignored? It is because of predetermined opinions that society has formed based off misconceptions and false realities. How can men wish to be heard if they're already being constantly silenced? To the general population, men's rights activists are perceived in a negative connotation and are almost always left unheard.
Racist, sexist, anti-gay, MRA, go away!
It's equality. I don't think they focus on actual men's rights issues, and rather it's just an attack on women and feminism.
Every time I hear of a men's rights activist, I hear anger and I hear very illogical.
Go, dude, we got them all. Shut the fuck
Men
up.
and boys are in crisis and they need your help and they need your support because they are human beings too.
And it's a misogynistic hate group actively working against women's equality.
Are hurt by masculinity or some of the things I was talking about a little early on.
Going back to the question asked earlier, which is how can men safely stand up for themselves as an organization without having to fear being called an associate of a hate group or misogynist, it's time to ask if there's an answer to that dilemma. To determine that, we must first answer 5 questions to determine what the ethical approach would be in solving it. Question 1. Which of the following options treats people with more dignity and respect? This is the rights approach. As history would have it, in terms of the rights approach, while men are treated with dignity and respect, men's rights activists are not. Instead, they're dehumanized as awful beings and are assumed to be terrible people. The majority of the time, men's rights activists and their issues go unheard, which is continually denying them basic human rights. Question 2. Does any one option do more good than harm? This is the utilitarian approach. Truthfully, as long as the movement remains pro-men and doesn't become anti-feminist, there's only more good than harm that can be caused by the men's right movement. As we now know, with so many men's issues, we need a group in which we can feel safe, included, and heard, and understood. Question 3. Which of the available options develops virtues most effectively? This is the virtue approach. What the men's right movement does for men, boys, and other men's rights activists is that it tries to fight for men's justice. While the men's right movement does not directly address the virtues of each individual, it achieves greater goals, which allow men to safely develop into virtuous men that otherwise they may have been denied to do so. Question 4. Is any one of the available options more fair and just? This is the fairness or justice approach. Currently, the men's right movement is highly opposed by massive amounts of mindless hatred, being that as a pro-men's movement, there is great fear that the movement will be anti-feminist and will only further take away from women's rights. But that is not the intention of the MRAs. What the men's rights activists wish is to see a world where men can freely discuss their issues without being fearful of being called weak, a misogynist, or any other harmful and unwarranted words, and that is most definitely fair. Question 5. Does any one of the available options make our community better as a result? This is the common goods approach. To live in a world where we all have equal rights is undoubtedly a common good that will make the entire world better as a result. With the men's rights activists preaching men's equality and feminists preaching women's equality, if the two were able to coexist and come together to solve sexist discrimination as a collective, that would be amazing. While something like that doesn't seem like it could realistically ever happen, in the meantime, in terms of ethics, men's rights are human rights, so they matter too, and equal rights for men is a step in the right direction. So what's the solution to how can men safely stand up for themselves as an organization without having to fear being called an associate of a hate group or a misogynist? The answer is that they can't, or at least not until the rest of the world opens themselves up to the idea that men's issues are real, and that men across the globe are hurting each and every single day. From an ethical standpoint, we must consider the rights and utilitarian approaches, because as humans, it is our right to be heard, to be helped, and to be treated equally, because where's the harm in that? So what can be done? By incorporating men's issues into youth education, perhaps the generations to come won't be so quick to dismiss our very real issues. In addition to that, by building abuse shelters and safe houses for men, thousands of lives can be saved. By amending laws that treat us differently, and by encouraging the end of stereotypes such as boys don't cry, we can slow down this overlooked oppression of men. Thank you for listening.